So, you've woken up in 16th century England. The air smells like wood smoke, sewage, and boiled cabbage. And that's on a good day. Your shoes? You don't have any. Your job? You're a professional human obstacle. Congratulations, you're a Tudor beggar, the lowest rung in a society that believes God hand-picked your misery. Oh, and if you're caught asking for food in the wrong parish, that's a public whipping. If you're lucky, welcome to a time where charity was a sin, disease was a hobby, and sleeping outside meant waking up with rats in your pockets. If you've ever thought your life was hard, hit that like button. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll thank your heating, your mattress, and indoor plumbing. Welcome to the grand opening of your new career, full-time, state-sponsored poverty. No need to clock in. You live here now, the gutters are your hallway, the mud is your carpet, and your co-workers are a delightful medley of coughing, lice-ridden strangers, and starving dogs. Congratulations, you're a beggar in Tudor England, which, if you're wondering, is a bit like being an unpaid extra in a historical drama where the only script you get is "Please sir, anything to eat." Let's set the scene. The year is sometime between Henry VIII getting bored of wife number 2 and Queen Elizabeth I, deciding ruffles are the pinnacle of fashion. The streets of London are bustling with merchants, noblemen, plague victims, and you, the least interesting part of the tableau. You're the person everyone sees, but no one really looks at, unless of course you've wandered into the wrong parish. In that case, they'll notice you long enough to beat you back out with a stick. Now, how did you end up here, you ask? Well, was it the enclosure movement, perhaps? That little economic makeover where landlords decided sheep were more profitable than people, so they fenced off common land and sent you packing? Or maybe your entire village got wiped out by the plague, leaving you with no family, no prospects, and definitely no inheritance. Or maybe, and here's the truly scandalous bit, you were just born poor, which in Tudor England was basically the same as being born guilty. You see, in the 1500s, the concept of helping the poor had all the warmth of a tax audit. Poverty wasn't viewed as a social problem, it was a moral failing. If you were struggling, it wasn't because of war, famine, enclosure, inflation, poor harvests, disease, or the small matter of being born into a collapsing feudal system. No, it was because you were lazy, untrustworthy, possibly possessed. In short, God was punishing you, and who are we to argue with God? Still with me? Great. Let's keep ruining your day. As a Tudor beggar, your position is precarious. You don't just wake up on the street and start panhandling like a cheerful busker. There are rules. Parish boundaries for starters. Each town and village is its own petty kingdom. And if you weren't born within the invisible scribble that counts as local, then you're an outsider, a threat, a parasite. Locals can ask for alms, outsiders get the boot, sometimes literally. And if you thought being hungry was bad, try being hungry and unwanted. Tudor society didn't just ignore the poor, it regulated them. You'd think being destitute would be punishment enough. But no, they had to spice it up with legal codes. Because what's poverty without paperwork? At this point, you're probably wondering, surely there's some sympathy for someone in my position. Well, there is, if you're a widow, or a cripple, or visibly dying in a poetic and publicly pitiful sort of way. Otherwise you fall into the category of sturdy beggar, which is a charming Tudor euphemism for probably faking it hanging. The term sturdy beggar appears in laws written by people wearing gold-threaded doublets and codpieces the size of fruit baskets. According to these fashion-forward moralists, the streets were teeming with able-bodied frauds just pretending to be poor. You know, for the vibe. So Parliament decided that if you could walk, you could work. Never mind that there were no jobs, and the fields you might have worked on were now filled with very content sheep. Oh, and don't bother appealing to the church. Yes, the same church that's technically supposed to care about charity and compassion. Sure, they'll toss you a crust of stale bread or let you sweep the cloister if you're lucky, but only after a nice long lecture about your eternal soul and how this suffering is all character building or whatever. So, what does your day look like now? Well, it starts with waking up in a corner of the street that's slightly less soaked than the others, hopefully without a dog peeing on your leg. Then it's off to find scraps, dodge beetles, and try to look both miserable and non-threatening at the same time. It's a fine art, performative suffering. You want to appear pitiful, but not dangerous, starving, but not diseased, desperate, but not too desperate, Think of it as poverty with branding. Of course, you're not alone. There are others, some with hollow eyes and dirty blankets, some with missing limbs, others with entire families in tow. Small, hungry children with faces like bruised peaches. The streets are a living collage of what happens when society decides you're not useful anymore. Let that sink in. You're not a citizen. You're not even a person. You're a problem to be moved, punished, or ignored. And in a time before welfare, housing programs, or basic human empathy became trendy, you're basically one wrong glance away from a public whipping. And if you're thinking this can't get worse, well, just wait. Because the Tudors didn't stop at being heartless. They were efficient about it. Soon, you'll learn just how illegal it is to be you. The system doesn't just want you gone, it wants you erased. But we'll get to that. Being poor in Tudor England wasn't just unfortunate, it was suspicious, dangerous even. To the powers that be, you weren't struggling, you were scheming. You were dirty, godless, and morally defective. You were filth. And not metaphorically. No, the law practically said so in writing. Let's take a stroll through the bureaucratic fever dream that is Tudor vagrancy law. Picture this. Parliament, mostly men with gout and a frankly unearned sense of superiority, huddled together in ornate chambers, crafting legislation to criminalize the presence of people like you, hungry people, homeless people, children, widows, the disabled. Anyone unlucky enough to not own land or wear shoes without holes. These were the faces of England's terrifying vagabond crisis. In 1531, Henry VIII, yes, the one with the headless wives and cholesterol dreams, passed the first Vagabonds Act. And it was a doozy. It introduced the idea that only the deserving poor could legally receive alms. Deserving meaning you were too old, too young, too sick, or too broken to work. If you were just able-bodied and starving, congratulations, you were now an outlaw. And it didn't stop there. By 1547, under the warm paternal gaze of Edward VI, the laws got a horrifying upgrade. Imagine being poor and getting caught. The punishment? Branding, with a hot iron on your chest, with the letter V for vagabond, not victory, in case that needs clarifying. It let everyone know that you were officially, legally, a societal disgrace. Bonus, if you were caught a second time, you could be enslaved for 2 years. Third time, execution. Yes, they created the death penalty for begging. Let that settle in. You could literally die for asking for bread too many times. By now you might be thinking, surely someone objected to all this. Well, not really. See, the Tudor elite believed in divine order, that every person was born into their station by God's own hand. If you were poor, it was because God wanted you to be. Interfering with that plan by feeding or helping you without official permission, that wasn't kindness, that was heresy-adjacent charity. A spiritual misdemeanor, with eternal consequence. It's important to remember how absurdly specific these laws were. You couldn't just exist as a poor person. You needed a license to beg. A literal piece of parchment stamped by a local official, stating you were indeed poor enough to be allowed to ask for help, and only within your own parish. Wander outside that line and you were just another roving menace, just another statistic for the constable to brag about punishing before his third pint of ale. And what if you moved parishes? Or your home was burned down, or your landlord kicked you out? Too bad. No license. No mercy. You were sturdy, which sounds nice, maybe even admirable, but in Tudor legal speak it basically meant probably lying. Now how does one enforce all this draconian nonsense? Enter the parish constables and beadles. Think of them as the world's worst customer service agents. Except instead of answering questions, they answered everything with a stick. Their job was to keep their patch beggar free, not poverty free, mind you, just visually tidy. If they saw you on the street without that precious piece of paper, they had every legal right to publicly whip you, lock you in the stocks, or parade you out of town like a flea-bitten parade float. Of course, not everyone caught up in this legal maze was a hardened scam artist. Many were just unlucky. A failed harvest, a bout of illness, a missing parent, and boom, you've gone from smallholder to outlaw in about 2 months. There was no welfare net, just a concrete floor and a rusty chain. What makes it all the more cruel is that Tudor England was not a land of plenty. The population was growing, Wages were shrinking, inflation was biting, and landlords? They were busy kicking tenants off their land to chase the wool boom, because sheep never asked for back pay. The result: thousands displaced, starving and desperate, just in time for Parliament to blame them for the chaos. Parliament helped create. How convenient. And it gets even darker. There were types of poor people, an entire social taxonomy. You had the impotent poor, those too old or sick to work. They got a thin slice of sympathy and maybe a potato if they smiled right. Then there were the able-bodied poor, viewed as morally bankrupt freeloaders. And finally the vagabonds, a catch-all term for anyone who didn't fit neatly into the first two boxes. You, definitely the third. So yes, Tudor law essentially declared your body a legal offence. Your breath, your hunger, your footprints on the road, all of it, criminal. And what about children? Oh, they weren't spared either. Street urchins could be rounded up, whipped, imprisoned, or forced into apprenticeships that were basically indentured servitude with extra beatings. But here's the kicker. The same laws that criminalized your existence also expected you to be invisible. You weren't supposed to beg unless licensed. But you also couldn't not beg because you had no job, no land, and no means of survival. You were damned if you did, executed if you did too much, and still starved if you didn't. Ever been punished? Just for existing? Tudor England perfected that. And just when you think being alive in this legal hellscape couldn't possibly get worse, wait until you find out what an actual day in your shoes looks like. Or rather, in your fraying burlap sack that technically used to be a tunic. Because next up, we follow you through your daily routine of humiliation, hunger, and dodging sticks from men named Jeffrey who take their badge way too seriously. It's just past dawn. Not that you saw the sun. You woke up under a cart behind the butcher's store, and let's just say that Tudor butchers were not known for cleaning up after themselves. The smell, imagine raw meat, blood, and whatever the rats dragged in overnight. Breakfast is whatever you didn't roll over in. Congratulations, you're awake. It's time to start another glorious day of being Tudor England's favourite street decoration. You're cold. Your feet hurt. You've got a suspicious bite on your shin, and the distinct feeling that your lice are unionizing. You stretch, if you can call it that, and begin the day's noble task, finding a new place to beg before the beadle finds you. Now, if you're imagining that begging is as simple as sitting with your hand out, think again. Tudor begging was performance art, survival strategy, and tactical maneuvering all rolled into one. It's like chess. If the pawns were starving, and the bishop occasionally hit you with a stick, first stop, not here. You can't stay in this parish much longer. You're not from around here, and they know it. You've overstayed your invisible welcome, and the locals are already giving you that look. You know the one. The you smell like death and desperation. And also my taxes might go up because of you look. Time to relocate. But moving between parishes is its own gamble. Without the right license, and you don't have one, because no one gives licenses to people who smell like yesterday's soup bones. You're breaking the law just by existing somewhere else. So, you keep your head down, shuffle past the churchyard, and avoid eye contact with anyone who looks like they might own something. Now, the real game begins. Where do you set up shop? The market? Too crowded, too competitive. There's that guy, with one arm, who sings psalms, and always gets the good spot near the baker's oven. He's a professional. He's got timing, volume control, even a sympathetic lean. You can't compete with that. The crossroads? Risky. That's where the beadles patrol. Those overzealous guardians of Tudor morality, with their iron-tipped staffs, and an uncanny ability to spot the difference between local pauper and filthy interloper. Spoiler, you're the second one. You settle for a shadowed corner near the tavern. Drunk patrons are your best shot. They're more generous, less coherent, and, if you're lucky, might actually drop something edible. You take your position, knees bent, back hunched, hands out. You start your lines. Alms for the poor. A crust. Good sir. A farthing for the Lord's sake. Nothing. One man scowls and spits near your feet. Another laughs and throws a turnip. You take it anyway. It's soft, bruised, and vaguely smells like mildew. You tuck it into your coat like treasure, because, in this life, it is. The hours drag. You shift positions to avoid cramps, Keep your eyes down so you don't look aggressive, but not too down, or they'll think you're asleep. It's a balancing act of patheticness. You have to look desperate enough to be worthy of pity, but not threatening enough to warrant a shove. Midday brings a flurry of foot traffic, merchants, housewives, apprentices with baskets. Some glance at you with the vague guilt of people who know they're doing fine, while someone else is doing this. Occasionally, a copper drops near your hand. You don't thank them, that could make them feel awkward. You just nod slightly, non-threatening, humble, practiced. And then there's him, the blind man, or rather the allegedly blind man. He arrives like clockwork every Tuesday, tapping dramatically with a stick, wearing mismatched shoes, quoting scripture in a voice that echoes 3 parishes away. People adore him. He rakes it in, farthing after farthing. Someone even gave him a meat pie last week. A whole pie. You watch, seething. Not because he's stealing food out of your mouth. Okay, yes, exactly that, but because he's good. Too good. His blindness is suspiciously inconsistent. You once saw him dodge a chicken cart with uncanny precision, but no one cares. He sells the illusion. You just sit there like wet laundry with an open palm. Let that sink in. Even in poverty, there's a hierarchy, a performance scale, and you, tragically, are not a headliner. By mid-afternoon, your back aches. Your feet are numb. Someone tried to steal your turnip, twice. You're exhausted, but you can't sleep. If you do, they'll either rob you, beat you, or worse, the beadle will drag you to the stocks for loitering with idleness, which is basically Tudor for existing where I don't want to see you. You shuffle back toward the edge of the parish as the sun droops into amber. You've made a meagre haul today. 2 pennies, half a roll, and the turnip. That's enough for almost nothing. But it's more than yesterday. You pass a man slumped against a wall. His eyes are closed, chest barely rising. You recognize him. You saw him last week. He had a song, a speech, a decent spot by the fishmonger. He doesn't move. You don't stop. You don't have the luxury. This is the rhythm, the churn. 1 out, 1 in, and tomorrow, you'll do it again. The same performance, the same lines. Maybe a different spot. Maybe a new bruise. Maybe less bread. But always, always the same silence from the world around you. Still think you could survive this? Well, you might, if you can master the next crucial skill, how to pretend your suffering is worse than it is. Because being poor isn't enough. You have to prove it, every single day. The trick isn't being miserable, that part's easy. You've got hunger like a lead weight in your stomach, your skin's a patchwork of sores and bruises, and the lice have turned your scalp into a bustling suburb. No, the trick is looking miserable, performatively, strategically, theatrically miserable. Tudor England doesn't pity quietly suffering souls. It pities those who bleed convincingly on cue. So you learn the craft. You study the best. The man who lurches with a wooden leg. That's not wood, it's broomstick and twine. The girl who twitches like her brain is boiling, it might be, but she leans into it with flair. The woman who sobs through tales of 7 dead children, each one named, each one cut down by the pot. It's always 7. It hits harder. And you? You're new to the stage? You haven't found your act yet. Today, you're trying the limping orphan routine. You drag your right leg behind you, wince theatrically every 3rd step. It's uneven, erratic, slightly overdone, like Tudor dinner theatre performed on wet cobblestones. You're learning. A passing merchant frowns. A boy giggles and throws a pebble, but one old woman gives you half a crust, so maybe it's working. You practice facial expressions in puddles, not smiling obviously. Grinning beggars make people suspicious, but a downturned mouth, glassy eyes, a look like you've just seen your last hope fall into a latrine, that gets results. It's all about the optics. Tudor charity is not about kindness. It's about spectacle. People want to see their piety in action. They want a before and after, even if after is just you chewing bread with the same dead stare. Let's take a moment to appreciate how ridiculous this is. In a society that barely has functioning sewers, there's a moral code about how authentically sad you need to look to deserve help. Imagine applying for food stamps today and being told, sure, but first, cry harder, and maybe add a limp toe. And yes, there were critics. Pamphlets circulated written by very concerned men with quills, decrying the false beggars and counterfeit poor. These hand-wringing guides included entire lists of beggar types, complete with coded slang, secret handshakes, and mythical criminal conspiracies involving blind harpists and one-legged pickpockets. Because apparently, even back then, people believed in organized poverty rings. Let's talk about the slang. Ruffler, hooker, clapper-dudgeon. These weren't job titles, they were beggar archetypes, catalogued like species. A dummerer pretended to be mute. A dummerer faked madness. A counterfeit crank feigned epilepsy. People with actual disabilities were ignored. But if you could simulate one with enough drool and twitching, jack. And here's the kicker. Many beggars had real afflictions, but because some faked it, everyone got treated like a fraud. So even the genuinely disabled had to upgrade their suffering just to compete. If your real limp wasn't dramatic enough, you added a crutch and a sob. If your cough wasn't phlegmy, you chewed mold for effect. Authenticity was irrelevant. Presentation was everything. There were tricks too. Smearing mud on your face for that rugged just-escaped-the-grave look. Dropping ash into your eyes to mimic infection. Binding limbs to create false deformities. If you were really bold, you might even bloodlet yourself a little. Just enough to look like a fresh wound. Not enough to pass out. Hopefully. But this was a high-risk game. The Beadles weren't idiots. Well, not all of them. Some knew the difference between real and fake. Some didn't care. And some just liked to hit things. If they caught you faking or just suspected you were, you could end up in the stocks, or branded, or worse, paraded through town with a sign reading counterfeit. Yes, public shaming as reality TV, centuries before anyone thought to pitch it to a streaming service. Still, the rewards could be worth it. A good day with a strong performance might mean enough scraps to almost feel full. Might mean avoiding the graveyard shift next to the corpse with the moving lice. Might mean living another week. And in a life this fragile, a week is gold. But let's not pretend this is glamorous. It's humiliating. Every groan, every forced cough, every fake seizure is another chisel stroke carving away your dignity. You're not a person anymore. You're a character. A caricature of sadness. A desperate story someone else tells at dinner to feel better about not helping. And here's the emotional gut punch. Some of the best performers used to be respectable. Former soldiers who lost limbs in war, widows of craftsmen, children of farmers burned out of their land. They had lives once, names, futures. Now they're stories with props. There's a man near the church wall who used to be a blacksmith. You can tell by the way he stares at his own hands, like they've betrayed him. His act? A trembling war veteran who forgets his name. It's not even an act, really, just memory loss filtered through trauma. But people still accuse him of faking, because that's easier than acknowledging the reality. Instagram didn't invent performative misery. It just added filters. In Tudor England, misery had to be curated. You weren't allowed to just suffer. You had to market your pain. Brand it. Make it palatable enough for someone to drop a halfpenny and feel morally superior about it. Let that sink in. You had to advertise your agony to survive. But here's the twist. The better you got at faking, the more dangerous it became. Too convincing, you're suspicious. Too pitiful, you're targeted. The same act that earns you bread today could land you in the stocks tomorrow, because in the end, no one wants to be reminded just how close they are to becoming you. So you keep performing. You cry, you cough, you stagger. You scrape together sympathy one theatrical sigh at a time. Because behind every exaggerated limp, there's a truth no one wants to see, but you'll show them. You have no choice. Ah, charity. That warm, glowing beacon of Christian compassion. That divine virtue. That smug, transactional exchange, where someone gives you a crumb and expects your eternal gratitude, and possibly your soul in return. Welcome to Tudor almsgiving, where helping the poor was less about kindness and more about spiritual insurance. Let's get something straight. In Tudor England, giving alms was a religious duty, a box to tick on your salvation checklist. Give to the poor, preferably while being watched, and maybe St. Peter lets you skip the queue at the pearly gates. But this wasn't charity in the modern non-profit tax-deductible sense. This was charity laced with suspicion, judgment, and occasionally a very stern lecture about your lifestyle choices. To the average Tudor citizen, The poor existed so the rich could practice humility. Not to be fed or clothed necessarily, that was optional. But to be seen groveling, pleading, blessing their benefactors with raspy, damp-voiced prayers of gratitude. The ideal beggar was a performance piece. Pitiful, passive, and deeply grateful for every cold crust tossed their way like a bone to a dog. If you deviated from this script, if you looked too healthy, too ungrateful, too alert, the charity dried up, fast, because let's face it, no one wants to donate to a beggar who makes eye contact. That's just rude. And of course, there were rules. Charity was supposed to be local, very local, like born, baptized, and probably bled here, local. If you wandered into a neighboring parish and asked for help, that was begging in enemy territory. The locals didn't want your problems becoming their problems, or worse, their taxes. So instead of help, you got escorted out, or whipped, or both. Depends on the beadle's mood. Even when charity was offered, it came with strings. Long, tangled strings knotted in moral superiority. You couldn't just receive bread. No, you had to listen to a parable first. Something about Lazarus, maybe a speech on God's mercy. Occasionally someone would make you recite the Lord's Prayer before handing over a halfpenny. Imagine being starving, sunburned, and half delirious, and someone turns it into a pop quiz. Let's not forget the churches. Oh, the churches were very involved. They had alms boxes, sure, but they also had strong opinions about who deserved those alms. The deserving poor, a phrase we've heard before, were few and far between. Widows, orphans, the blind, if their eyes were sufficiently milky. Everyone else was categorized as lazy, sinful, or criminal, often all three. One sermon warned that giving to the wrong kind of poor person could actually harm your soul, a divine whoops. So yes, you were a risk, a spiritual contaminant. Some priests advised their flock to be cautious about giving to beggars, lest they inadvertently fund sin. Because clearly, if you give a starving man a coin, he's going straight to the tavern for mead and debauchery. Not bread. Never bread. Certainly not soap. There were also rich people, nobles, merchants, aldermen, Tudor England's influencers. Their version of charity often came in the form of public spectacles of benevolence. Maybe they'd donate a hogshead to the town poorhouse. Maybe they'd sponsor a soup cauldron at Christmas. All very generous, all very public, usually announced by a crier or a strategically placed plaque. You, of course, were expected to be visible during these charitable events, shivering in the background, quiet, awed, possibly crying. You were part of the scenery, the proof that their wealth had purpose, and God help you if you didn't look appreciative enough. Ingratitude was practically a sin. But charity could also be personal. A housewife might hand you scraps from her kitchen, still warm. A child might sneak you a plum. Sometimes you got a smile, small, fleeting, but real. Those moments were rare, precious, not about salvation or social performance, just human, and you remembered them. Long after the sermons faded, still, those soft moments didn't change the system. And the system was clear. Charity was a tool of control. You were not being lifted up, you were being held in place, managed, fed just enough to not die, helped just enough to not revolt. Because if beggars starved too much, they became desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things, like steal, or riot, or get ideas. Reflect on that for a moment. Charity existed not to improve your life but to prevent you from disrupting someone else's. Is it really help if it makes you feel worse? And then there were the humiliations. The man who threw coins in the dirt just to watch you crawl, the merchant who laughed while you thanked him, then doubled back to slap the bread from your hand, the baker who told you to work for your food, while standing in front of a help-wanted sign that very specifically did not mean you, but you had to smile. Always smile. Even if your teeth ached, and your stomach groaned, and your soul had quietly packed up and left last week, because charity was performance, and you were always on stage. There were days you didn't beg, days when the shame pressed too hard on your chest, and your legs felt too heavy to shuffle into the public square. Days when you sat behind the tavern and cried because you couldn't remember the last time someone called you by your name, not just that beggar, and on those days no one noticed. The world turned, and the bread went stale, and the sermons echoed on without you. Because charity in Tudor England wasn't really about the poor. It was about the people who gave their image, their salvation, their pride. You were just the backdrop. Tomorrow you'll go out again. Smile, limp, pray. Pretend it helps. Maybe today's bread will come with fewer strings. Maybe someone will look at you and see a person, not just a problem, but probably not. Nightfall in Tudor England doesn't arrive politely. It crashes down like a trapdoor. 1 minute you're squinting through grimy daylight. The next you're swallowed by a darkness so thick it feels like it has weight. The streets empty fast. The market shutters. Candles flicker in windows, not for light, but as a declaration. We are inside. You are not. And you? You're outside. Still. Again. Because you're always outside. The day's scraps are tucked away. A crust, a turnip core, 2 coins that clink like mockery. You've earned enough to almost not starve. But not enough for shelter. Because there's no shelter. Not unless you count the sagging, rat-infested ruins of the old chapel wall, or the broken cart behind the tannery. A favourite spot if you don't mind the smell of death dipped in vinegar. So you walk, slowly, through alleys that reek of fish guts, spoiled milk, and the occasional open sewer. You've learned to step carefully, not just to avoid puddles of questionable origin, but because you never know what or who is curled up in the shadows. A fellow beggar, a feral dog, a bored constable with a stick and something to prove. You keep your head down. You walk like fog. Quiet, shapeless, forgettable. There are options. Technically. The church porch, if it's not already full. The graveyard, if you're not squeamish. The stables, if the innkeeper doesn't catch you. But each one comes with risk. Get spotted, and you could be dragged out by your collar, or beaten, or simply ignored, left to freeze beside the animals that frankly get treated better. Tonight, it's the graveyard. Again. There's a spot near the southern wall, tucked behind a tilted headstone. You settle in, knees pulled to your chest, coat wrapped tight, breath clouding in the air. You nestle into the damp earth, back against. The names on the graves have long since faded. You imagine they were kind. You hope they don't mind the company. The cold seeps in, not like winter cold today. No heating, no layers, no thermal socks. This is cold that curls into your bones and hums there like a lullaby of frost. You shiver, but quietly. Loud noises invite attention, and attention at night is rarely helpful. That rustling behind the crypt. Probably a dog. Hopefully not a man. Best not to check. Let's talk about sleep. In theory, it's when the body restores itself. In reality, it's a series of twitchy half-dreams interrupted by wind, footsteps, or the terrifying crack of wood under pressure. You don't sleep so much as pause. You fade in and out, mind drifting like smoke. Hunger follows you even into your dreams. And the creatures of the night? Oh, they visit. Mice nibble crumbs from your lap. Fleas stage full-scale revolutions on your skin. Lice, of course, are your constant bedfellows. They don't bite much at night. Small mercies. But they move. You can feel them dancing under your clothes. It's like being haunted by invisible peasants. Then come the rats. The real stars of Tudor nightlife. Plump, fearless, and incredibly organized. One sniffs your foot, another scurries past your ear. You swat weakly. It hisses. You apologize. You always apologize. This is their territory after all. But it's not just the vermin. There's another kind of predator in the dark. Men. Desperate men. Drunk men. Cruel men. They lurk near the edge of sleep, waiting for the moment when your guard slips. You've heard stories. Some women don't sleep anymore, not if they're alone. Not ever. A sound, a boot scrape, jolts you upright. Your heart punches your ribs. But it's just another beggar. A boy, maybe 12. He nods. You nod. No words. Words cost energy. He lies down a few feet away, curls up like a cat, and vanishes into stillness. You wonder who he was, who he is. Maybe a runaway. Maybe an orphan. Maybe just unlucky. Everyone out here is unlucky. That's the only qualification required. At some point your body stops shivering. That's not good. That's the cold settling too deep. You clutch your arms tighter, hum a broken melody under your breath. Anything to stay awake, stay alert, stay alive. The night stretches on like a cruel joke. Somewhere, bells toll. Maybe midnight. Maybe 1. time loses its meaning. You focus on your breath, on the feeling of your ribs rising and falling, on the ache in your hips, on the weight of your own silence. Let that sink in. The hardest part isn't the cold. It's the invisibility. You could die right here behind this stone, and no one would know. Not for days. Maybe not ever. You are background noise in someone else's life. Still, you endure, because what else is there? Dawn doesn't arrive. It leaks in, slowly, like someone forgot to draw the curtain properly. Light spills over the headstones in dull streaks of grey. The air smells of smoke, mould and wet leaves. Your muscles creak as you stand. A rat darts between your feet. You nod politely. You survived. Again. You stretch, shake the dirt from your coat, take a bite of the crust you saved. It's hard enough to chip a tooth, but it tastes like triumph. You eat in silence while the world around you wakes up. Shopkeepers unlocking doors, carts rattling down cobbles, roosters pretending they were useful. You're not rested, you're not clean, you're not okay, but you're alive. And that's enough, because tonight, you'll do it again. And tomorrow night, and every night after. Until you can't. It's hard to feel human when rats treat you like furniture. Let's play a little Tudor game, shall we? It's called Is That Itchy Spot Just an Itchy Spot? Spoiler, it's not. In fact, it's never just an itchy spot. It's probably lice, or scabies, or ringworm. Possibly all three. Maybe a plague bonus round. Welcome to the contagious wonderland that is your immune system's personal torture dungeon. Street life in 16th century England. To begin, let's clarify something. Hygiene, as a concept, was mostly a rumour at this point. Soap existed, sure, but it was a luxury, and you had to choose between using it or, say, eating that week. Baths? Maybe monthly, in a cold river with some reeds watching. Even the rich smelled like wet sheep, and regret. You smell like everything they threw out the window. Now let's talk water. Clean water, that precious mythical liquid. You might find some if it rains, if you're lucky enough to catch it in a hat without holes. Otherwise, your choices are stagnant puddle, communal trough, or public well used by both people and horses. And by used, we mean urinated in. Drinking this water won't quench your thirst. It'll start a countdown, because inside that cup is a party of microbes wearing tiny Tudor hats, ready to turn your intestines into a slip and slide. The most popular souvenir from that water? Dysentery? Ah, good old bloody flux. A name that says exactly what it is. One drink, and you're locked in a squat and pray situation for the next 3 days. No relief, no privacy, and certainly no dignity. Just you, your backside, and a growing puddle of shame behind the fishmonger's stall. But wait, there's more. Let's take a moment to meet the all-star of Tudor horror. Sweating sickness. The Usain Bolt of death. You'd feel fine in the morning, maybe a little tired. And by sundown, you're shaking, delirious, and soaking through your only shirt. Within 24 hours, you're dead. Or worse, half dead and hallucinating that your mother's soup is whispering secrets. The sweating sickness made the plague look lazy. And speaking of plague, yes, it's still around. The Black Death never truly packed up and left. It just settled in, like a rude cousin. Bubonic plague, with its delightful symptoms, fever, chills, and those adorable golf ball-sized buboes oozing like overripe fruit. If one of your fellow beggars starts coughing and clutching their armpit, maybe shuffle a few tombstones over. Not that it'll help. If you're close enough to smell them, it's already too late. Now let's check in on your skin. Specifically the parasites living rent-free on it. Lice, the eternal companions. They live in your seams, your hair, your eyebrows if you're unlucky. They bite, they breed, they gossip. You scratch, and all you get is blood and shame. And just when you think you've won, surprise, you've created open sores. Welcome to Scabies, the sequel. At this point, your body is a battlefield, and your immune system? It's a drunk knight with a wooden spoon. You've got boils, you've got rashes, you've got a mysterious cough that might be tuberculosis, or might just be the air you're breathing. Either way, it sounds like someone grinding gravel in your lungs. And how does society respond to your charming bouquet of ailments? With suspicion. Sickness isn't treated. It's blamed. You're not ill? You're contagious. Dangerous. A moral threat. Not just a medical one. If you sneeze too loud, someone might throw a stone. If you collapse in public, they might assume you're faking. If you die in the street, well, they'll get to you eventually. Let that sink in. Your death is just another inconvenience to clean up, like manure or bad weather. What happens if you try to get help? If you're lucky, a passing friar might whisper a prayer and then back away slowly. If you make it to a hospital, and we use that term loosely, you're entering a room filled with other plague-scented unfortunates. There are no antibiotics, no real doctors, just prayers, herbs, leeches and the occasional bleeding to balance your humours. They might drill a hole in your skull to let the evil spirits out. Spoiler, the spirits stay in. You leave. Now consider this. You're surrounded by people who are equally sick, equally filthy, and equally desperate. Diseases bounce between bodies like gossip at a church social. One cough, and suddenly half the graveyard is pre-booked. And yet, somehow you keep moving. You keep begging. You keep hoping that tomorrow's cough isn't the cough. That your rash stays just rashy enough to avoid a panic. You learn to recognize symptoms in others. Who's too far gone? Who to avoid? Who to mourn quietly, privately, behind the fish cart where no one's watching. But just when you think you've made it through the night, survived the rats, the rain, the creeping ooze on your neck, there's a new problem. The sun's rising. Yes, but so is he. The beadle. He's seen you before. Maybe yesterday. Maybe last week. He doesn't care that you're sick. He doesn't care that you nearly died. All he sees is a dirty shape in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he's got orders. So now the game changes. You've survived the plague, the filth, the thirst, the lice. But can you survive him? You hear the staff before you see him. A slow, deliberate tap against the cobblestones. Steady, rhythmical, like a bored hangman's metronome. Tap, tap, tap. And then he appears. Cloak flapping. Chin lift. Face set in that expressionless smirk unique to small men with too much authority and zero oversight. The parish beadle. He's not technically a cop. He's not a priest either. He lives in that squishy middle ground between bureaucratic nuisance and violent street warden. Think more security, but armed with a metal-tipped staff and a deep-seated hatred for anyone who hasn't paid a tithe in recent memory. His job to keep the streets clean, which, in Tudor terms, means poor-free. And today, that means you try not to make eye contact. A rookie mistake. If he notices you flinch, it's over. He'll zero in like a hawk with a budget haircut and a ledger to fill. Beadles don't need a reason. They are the reason. Still, you're already caught. His staff halts inches from your toes. He tilts his head, scans you like an accountant considering which limb to tax. Then he speaks. Where's your license? The license. The blessed, mythical, never had one piece of parchment that says you're legally allowed to beg within your own parish. Spoiler, you're not from here. And you certainly don't have it, but saying so out loud would be like asking him to throw you into the nearest mud puddle, face first, and then fine you for the laundry bill. You mumble something, a cough, a shrug, an unconvincing claim that you were just resting. He raises a brow. You can tell he's not buying it, but he enjoys the charade, the little power dance. He leans closer, sniffs, recoils. The smell helps your case. A little. Now here's the twisted part. Beadles were often poor themselves. Not quite as destitute as you, but close. They weren't noblemen or priests. They were working-class enforcers who played middleman for a system that despised them only slightly less than it despised you. And because of that, they enforced the rules with extra flair. The closer someone is to falling down the ladder, the harder they kick those already at the bottom. Sometimes it's personal. Maybe you annoyed him last week. Maybe you stole his spot by the bakery. Maybe you just exist. Today, he's in a mood. He jabs you in the ribs with the staff. Not enough to injure, just enough to hurt. You're not supposed to be here. That's it. That's the charge. Existence in the wrong location. A criminal act punishable by stock time, whipping, or just being paraded around the town square like an unwanted vegetable. The best case scenario? He chases you out of town. Worst, he drags you to the constable, and you spend the night in the lockup. A wooden box soaked in piss, shared with 3 other coughing humans and 1 goose that no one's claimed. But today, the beadle's feeling generous, or lazy. He gestures with his staff. South, out, away. Go on then. before I change my mind. You don't argue, you nod, you shuffle, you leave, you don't run. Running looks guilty, but you also don't linger. That staff might come swinging, and it leaves bruises that last longer than dignity. Behind you, the tap resumes. Tap, tap, tap. Another victim awaits. Let's pause and breathe that in. A system so broken that the enforcers are barely better off than the punished. A society where power trickles down in the form of petty violence, sanctioned humiliation, and territorial arrogance. The beadle doesn't hate you specifically, he hates what you represent. Proof that the system is failing, and if he can hit you hard enough, maybe that failure disappears for a few minutes. Beadles were everywhere. Every parish had one. Some had multiple. They didn't just police beggars, they also handled drunkards, wayward apprentices, and scolded wives. They were the duct tape of Tudor order, stretched thin, fraying, occasionally smacking people in the face for good measure. And their tools? Not just staffs. They carried whips, keys, sometimes even small shackles. But their real weapon was paperwork. Reports, registers. If a beadle wrote you up, your name went into the parish ledger, and once you were recorded as a vagabond, you weren't just punished, you were branded, figuratively or literally, as scum. That V on the chest we talked about. Guess who gets to make that happen? Some beggars tried to bribe them. A coin here, a secret there. It rarely worked. The risk was too high. One accusation of corrupt enforcement, and the beadle could end up on the other side of the stick. So most played it safe. That meant sticking to protocol. And protocol meant ruining you. Of course, not all beadles were cruel. Some were tired. Resigned. You'd see it in their eyes. The look of a man who knows he's crushing someone for no good reason, but can't afford to stop. Once, a beadle let you sleep behind the bakehouse for an hour. He didn't say anything, just walked past and pretended not to see. You never forgot it, and you never expected it again. But those moments were rare. Most beadles weren't kind. They were instruments, blunt, bored, underpaid instruments of state-enforced misery. And you were their practice target. You'll see him again tomorrow. Same staff, same walk, same question. And next time, he might not be in the mood to let you off with a jab, so you move on. Limp slightly. Make yourself smaller. Look for a new corner where the shadows are thick and the beadles thin. Because in this world, survival isn't about food or faith. It's about staying invisible. You might think of begging as a solo endeavor, just you, your hand outstretched, and society's disapproving frown looming over you. But in Tudor England, sometimes even the outcasts needed a team. Enter the beggar gang. Think of it as poverty's version of a startup. No funding, no ethics, and the business model is don't die. These weren't your friendly neighborhood Robin Hood operations. They were pragmatic alliances, forged out of shared misery and mutual desperation. Safety in numbers, sure, but also strategy. One man distracts the constable, another slips through the market with nimble fingers, one weeps outside the apothecary, while another slips inside to steal a mouldy heel of bread. It's not glamorous, it's not noble, but it might keep you alive. Let's start with the basics. These groups had names, roles, and, believe it or not, something resembling structure. Brotherhoods of beggars, they were sometimes called, the kind of organization you couldn't apply to, but somehow ended up in once your last family member died, and the frostbite set in. Some were loose coalitions, others operated like criminal syndicates, complete with hierarchies, rules and initiation rites, involving fake wounds and the ability to convincingly sob on command. One of the most infamous tales from the time describes a group known as the Blind Brotherhood. Members would feign blindness, complete with bandaged eyes and outstretched sticks, and work in coordinated patterns across towns. One would moan pitifully, another would guide him while pocketing loose change, and a third kept watch for approaching officials. They weren't blind, of course, but they were very good at pretending. So good, in fact, that some of them eventually forgot how to walk in a straight line without their props. And then there were the Abraham men. These were the supposed madmen, beggars who faked insanity to earn coin and sympathy. They'd wear bizarre outfits, chant nonsense, twitch at imaginary demons. Society feared the insane, but it also pitied them. So the Abraham men made madness into currency. It was performance art, survival instinct, an unintentional street theatre all rolled into one. Of course, this all fed the growing paranoia among the respectable classes. Pamphlets circulated, warning of beggar conspiracies. Guides like the groundwork of conny catching, and a caveat for common cursitors detailed supposed networks of impostors, each with their own slang and signs. They painted a picture of a secret society so sophisticated it made the Freemasons look like a book club. But let's step back. Not every beggar gang was some Machiavellian crime ring. Most were just clusters of people with nowhere else to go. Sometimes they travelled together for safety, especially women and children. There were roaming bands that looked more like families than gangs. Shared stories, shared lice, bonds forged in filth and frost. Not glamorous, but genuine. Still, there was danger in association. Get caught in a group, and you weren't just a beggar, you were part of a mob. Authorities didn't like mobs. They didn't like networks. They liked things they could isolate, catalogue, punish individually. A group of 5 starving people, that was a riot waiting to happen. So, the laws cracked down. Vagrancy acts were updated to address company of beggars. If you were caught moving with others, it could be assumed with no proof whatsoever that you were part of a criminal scheme. Punishments ranged from public whipping to branding to forced labour. In one cheerful case, a group of vagrant rogues was nailed into separate barrels and rolled down a hill, allegedly. History's unclear on whether this was punishment or just Tudor entertainment. Let that settle in. Simply not being alone was treated as a threat. Still, for many, the risk was worth it. Loneliness was its own kind of death. Groups offered companionship, protection, a crude version of family. When someone got sick, others kept watch. When someone died, they helped bury the body, or at least moved it somewhere less conspicuous. There was a woman you once walked with. Her name was something soft. Anne, maybe. She carried a child on her hip, and sang hymns off-key. She'd been a servant once, got thrown out when the lady of the house caught her stealing a slice of pie. Now she worked the road, she made up stories about her baby's father. Sometimes he was a sailor, sometimes a ghost. She died one winter night near York. The frost took her. You helped wrap the child in your cloak, and walked the next 10 miles in silence. That's what these gangs were. Underneath the drama, ghost collectives. Lives scraped together for warmth, then scattered again like ash in the wind. But society didn't see that. It saw threats. Disease. Lies. Sin. It saw a system it didn't understand, so it punished it into oblivion. And yet, despite the danger, despite the judgment, beggars kept banding together, because it's one thing to starve, it's another to starve alone. When the world hates you, who do you become? Sometimes the answer is you become each other's lifeline. The world can keep its laws. You have something it can't legislate. Solidarity. Let's not sugarcoat this. Not that you've tasted sugar in years. Hunger changes things. It starts as a gnaw, a polite ache in your belly. Then it grows teeth. Then it starts whispering ideas. Strange ideas. Dangerous ones. It's not just discomfort, it's transformation. And in Tudor England, when the bread's gone, and the mercy's gone with it, you find out what you're really willing to do to survive. The first compromise is pride, but that already vanished somewhere back in chapter 2, right around the time someone paid you to bark like a dog in the market square. You did it. Of course you did. They tossed you a full apple, bruised, yes, but whole. That was a good day. But the real descent starts when the food truly dries up, when even the stale crusts are gone, when the rich folks are inside chewing beef with gravy and you're chewing your fingernails for nutrients. That's when the line begins to blur, between begging and taking, between surviving and stealing, between desperation and something darker. You start small. A carrot left too close to a stall's edge. A lump of coal from a passing cart. No one notices, or if they do, they pretend not to. You're just background noise. A smudge on the lens of daily life, but the stakes rise. The hunger sharpens. And eventually you steal something real. Maybe it's bread. Maybe it's an egg. Maybe it's from someone just as poor as you. That's the worst part. Sometimes there's no one left to steal from except the other beggars. You don't mean to. You're not a villain. But when you find that roll hidden under a blanket and no one's looking, you take it. You eat it. Fast, chewing through guilt and crust alike. The next morning someone cries. Their only food is gone. You stare at the ground and say nothing. And just like that, something inside you shifts. Hunger doesn't just eat your body, it eats your morals. You tell yourself it's temporary, that you'll make it up somehow, that it's the world's fault, not yours. And you're right. But also, not. Tudor England doesn't care about ethics. It cares about appearances. Get caught, and you're not a starving soul in need. You're a thief, a vagabond, an enemy of order. The punishment? Stocks, whipping, maybe worse. Some beggars sell what little they own. Clothes, tools, even children. Yes, that's not a metaphor. Some sell their own children, usually to a workhouse, or to a farmer in need of apprentices. The word sounds kind. It's code for unpaid labor, beatings and beds of straw shared with rats. But it's a meal, and that's more than the child was getting with you. Some sell their bodies. Again, not metaphor. Desperate women offer what they must. Not because they want to, because they have no choice. Prostitution among the poor wasn't uncommon. It was just unspoken. The law condemned it. Society ignored it. But behind every darkened alley and broken fence, a transaction was happening. Sometimes for a coin, sometimes for food, sometimes just for a warm place to sleep. And others? They dig. Graveyards, you see, are full of things. Not just bones, clothes, jewelry, coins slipped into hands for the afterlife. You know this because someone tells you. You're sitting near the fire, and a man leans over and says, "There's copper in the ground." "He's done it," he says. Late at night, quick hands, careful shovel work, in and out. You laugh. You don't want to believe him. But that night, the hunger is louder than your morals. You go. You stand in the cemetery, heart pounding, the moon like a guilty eye overhead. You dig. Slowly. The dirt is wet, cold, heavy. You find nothing. Just a rotten sleeve. A tooth. You drop your tool and run. You don't try it again. But you thought about it. And that's enough to haunt you. These are the things you do for bread. And yet, even now, you're not alone in this. Others understand. They've done worse. There's a woman who once boiled her shoes for soup. A man who sold his own teeth to a barber surgeon. A child who stole communion wafers and ate them like crackers. These aren't legends. They're real. They're you. And sometimes, amid this quiet horror, you laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it's absurd. Because your life has become a punchline whispered by history. Because if you don't laugh, you'll scream, or stop entirely. But here's the strangest part. Some nights, even after all this, you still dream about a warm bed, about bread with butter, about waking up clean. You hold on to that dream, tight, because hope, foolish, fragile, irrational hope, is the one thing Tudor England hasn't stolen from you yet. Not completely. So far we've talked about poverty like it's a universal punch in the gut. And it is. But some people get kicked twice. Enter women. Because if you thought being a beggar in Tudor England was bad, try doing it while also being blamed for original sin, expected to be invisible, and still somehow required to look humble and chaste while starving in a ditch. For a woman, every danger of the street comes with a cruel add-on. Hunger comes with judgment, cold comes with vulnerability, and violence, that comes standard. Let's start with the basics. Men might be called sturdy beggars, lazy rogues, or cunning vagrants. Women, they get labelled as whores. Doesn't matter what you're doing. Sit too long in one spot, must be waiting for a client, talk to a man in public, clearly negotiating, exist without a male protector. Obviously sinful. You're either a widow, a wife, or a walking scandal. And if you're none of those things, if you're alone, ragged and breathing, you become an open invitation for trouble. Let's talk about the kinds of trouble. There's the daily harassment. Men who leer at you not because you're attractive. Let's be honest, you're covered in filth and sadness, but because they can, because power doesn't require beauty. It just requires vulnerability. A woman sleeping under a cart is defenseless. A woman begging for bread can't afford to say no, and they know it. There are stories whispered by candlelight, if you're lucky enough to find shelter for the night. Stories of women pulled into alleys, of girls too young to understand what's happening, of punishment marriages, where a man who assaults you offers to marry you afterward, and the law says that makes it okay. You become his wife, and also his property. And if you protest, if you fight back, you're the liar, the seductress, the criminal. You brought it on yourself by being poor and visible, and worst of all, a woman. It's not just the men in alleyways you have to fear. It's the laws. Tudor society had an endless appetite for punishing women. Step out of line, and suddenly you're not just a nuisance, you're a witch. Yes, the W word. It didn't take much. An accusation, a rumor, a birthmark, a loud opinion. Some men got called thieves. Some women got dragged out of town, tied to a cart and screamed at by villagers until they disappeared into the woods. If you were lucky, that's all they did. And the irony? Sometimes the very things that kept you alive were the things they used against you. Know a few herbs? You're a witch. Can fake a vision to earn a coin? Witch. Have a child out of wedlock because you were assaulted and had nowhere else to go? Definitely a witch. Let that sink in. Self-preservation could get you killed. Then there's childbirth. No midwife, no clean blankets, no clean anything. If you're lucky, another beggar woman helps. If not, you do it alone, behind a barn, in a graveyard, on cold stone, screaming into your sleeve so no one hears. Because if they do, they might not come to help. And after, you have a baby, another mouth to feed, a new target, a reason for people to pity you, or spit on you. Some see you as brave, most just see you as careless, because motherhood without a marriage license, that makes you the lowest of the low. You try to beg with the baby. People give more, not because they care, but because babies make their guilt itch. You learn to hold the child just right, angle your body to look tragic but clean, but not too tragic. Then they assume you're cursed. There's a woman you met once, Maud. She said she'd been a servant years ago. Her master's son got her pregnant. She kept the child, got thrown out, lived on the road, carried her son on her back until he could walk, then taught him how to fake a cough. Last time you saw her, she was holding his hand and whispering a psalm outside the bakery. She looked proud, even in rags. She died that winter. That's the truth of it. Being a woman meant watching others like you fall, one by one, from childbirth, from assault, from hunger, from cold. You felt like you were next, always next, and yet, somehow, you endure. You walk slower at night, sleep in hidden places, share fire with other women when you can, warn each other about which constables stare too long. You form alliances, quiet ones, silent glances across crowded markets, a crust shared, a child carried. You become each other's armor. Still, every step is calculated, every smile measured, every refusal a risk. Because in Tudor England, being poor was dangerous. But being a poor woman, that was a sentence written in fear. Eventually someone had an idea. A bold, innovative, completely misguided idea. What if we could fix poverty by punishing it harder? And thus, Tudor England's social reform system was born, not with compassion, but with cages, because nothing says we care like locking people in buildings and calling it mercy. Let's talk about the earliest of these misguided inventions, the workhouse. Sounds productive, right? A place where the poor could work in exchange for food and shelter. In reality, it was less job training and more slow-motion misery simulator. You'd wake at dawn, be handed a tool you didn't know how to use, and be ordered to produce goods under the watchful eyes of men who believed sleep was a moral failure. And the work, always useless. Break stones, pick oakum, spin thread on broken spindles. If the product was flawed, it didn't matter. The goal wasn't productivity, it was suffering. Because if you weren't suffering, you weren't improving. And God forbid the poor be comfortable. These places were often called houses of correction, which is a bit like calling a dungeon a thinking room. The theory was simple. Poverty wasn't a symptom of a broken system. It was a behavior. And like any bad behavior, it needed to be corrected. With shame, with pain, with cold walls, and harder floors. Let that settle in. They thought you could discipline someone out of being poor. And the food? Barely. Grill, if you were lucky, bread crusts. A thin soup, made from yesterday's regret. You'd be hungry all the time. Which was by design. They wanted you miserable enough to not come back. Now, let's imagine you're one of the incurable cases. Maybe you're too old to work, too sick, too visibly broken. You'd be sent to a poorhouse, less labour, more waiting to die. A room with 20 others, all coughing in unison, like some tragic choir of forgotten souls. No privacy, no dignity, just the slow decay of bodies no one would claim. And you couldn't leave. Not unless someone vouched for you. And no one ever did. But the Crown had bigger dreams. What if entire cities could be rid of their beggars? Enter the policy of transportation. Not trains. This is the 1500s. We're talking about physically shipping poor people away. Some were sent to Ireland. Later, others would be shipped to the Americas. Or Australia. If you were particularly unlucky, you were just abandoned on the edge of nowhere, with a stern warning not to return. And if you did return, whipping, branding, or a little stint in the Bridewell house, a kind of early prison for vagrants. You'd be put to work, beaten daily, and given religious lectures by men who hadn't missed a meal in decades. The logic behind all this? If begging is a disease, then isolation is the cure. Still, they weren't done inventing horrors. In some towns, they introduced the beggar badge. This was a literal badge, a wooden or metal token you were required to wear, showing that you were a licensed beggar. Sounds official, almost helpful, but in practice, it painted a target on your chest. People mocked you, children threw stones. Some merchants refused to serve you, because nothing encourages pity like public shaming. And let's not forget the warning houses. These were holding cells for beggars awaiting punishment. A kind of medieval purgatory. Inside, you'd sit on stone floors, chained to strangers, and wait for judgment. Days. Sometimes weeks. Your only crime, being hungry in the wrong place. One man you knew, Thomas, ended up there. He begged outside a church on the wrong feast day. Too visible, too loud. The vicar took offence. Thomas disappeared for 3 weeks. When he returned, he was thinner, quieter. He didn't beg anymore, just sat on the curb staring. A human ghost. And what of children? Surely they were spared? No. They were put to work too, shoved into apprenticeships that lasted until adulthood, or death, whichever came first. Some cleaned chimneys, others worked in dye houses, where the fumes boiled their lungs, and girls often hired into homes as domestic help, a polite way of saying unpaid, unprotected, and at constant risk. All of this, mind you, was considered progress. To the government, these solutions were signs of a compassionate state. Look how many beggars we've helped. Look how many we've housed, whipped or shipped to another continent. Problem solved, except the problem didn't go away. Because hunger doesn't care about policy. Poverty doesn't vanish. Because you've renamed it. You can hide it. Punish it. Dress it up in sermons, and starve it behind stone walls. But it lingers, it leaks out, it finds the cracks in your system, and it waits. So yes, there were cures for begging, just none that involved helping beggars. But what happens when these punishments aren't enough? When local laws fail to scare you off the street? Well then, it goes national. Because coming up next is a queen with a pen, a parliament with a grudge, and a law that makes everything so much worse. You know things are bad when the monarch of a global empire takes time out of her busy schedule, between beheading cousins and dodging assassination plots, to write laws about you. Not nobles, not foreign spies. You, a barefoot beggar with 3 teeth and a turnip in your pocket. Apparently, you're a national crisis. Let's talk about the 5072 Vagabonds Act, courtesy of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana, Virgin Queen, sworn enemy of idle poor people. The act was designed to address what was delicately referred to as the problem of wandering beggars. That's you, by the way. You're the problem, not the collapsing economy, not the greedy landlords fencing off fields for sheep. And what did this act propose? Oh, nothing too serious. Just public whipping. For a first offence. A sort of gentle welcome package. The law required constables to take vagrants, especially those without ties to the local parish, and flog them until they learned their lesson, or until their backs stopped working, whichever came first. But it didn't stop there. If you were caught again, the punishment escalated. You could be branded, not with a tattoo or a fine, with a hot iron, burned flesh, on your chest, a letter V for vagabond. So every time someone saw you shirtless, which given your living situation was often, they'd know you were a repeat offender, a branded criminal. You might as well tattoo "I am society's mistake" across your ribcage. Caught a third time? Congratulations. You could now be sentenced to death. That's right, death. For begging. For existing in the wrong place without property, employment, or a license. Elizabethan England, where poverty was treason adjacent. Let that sink in. A country built on divine right, colonial ambition, and powdered wigs thought you were the real threat. And this wasn't just an idle threat. People were executed, hanged as examples, whipped through the streets, paraded on carts with placards hung around their necks. Rogue, idler, thief, all for the crime of trying to stay alive without inconveniencing a merchant's line of sight. Even the Act's language was telling. It didn't talk about humans. It talked about types. Rogues, vagabonds, sturdy beggars, like you were a subspecies of pest, not someone's child, not a worker displaced by war or illness or famine, just vermin in need of regulation. And you know what makes it worse? The Act also introduced the concept of local responsibility, meaning every parish had to take care of its own poor. So if you were born in one town and starved in another, that town had every right to dump you in a cart and send you back, like a broken package, postage due. Of course, this created a lovely side effect. Poor people being rounded up and forcibly relocated like livestock. Constables dragging the weak, the sick, the elderly across miles of mud and misery because they weren't someone else's problem anymore. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth sat on a velvet throne, sipping imported wine and declaring that idle hands were the devil's playground. Not that she ever had to scrub mud off her ankles or sleep with a rat chewing her hair. But let's not pretend this was purely a royal invention. Parliament cheered her on. The wealthy landowners, many of whom caused the poverty in the first place, applauded her efforts. After all, nothing makes the wealthy sleep better than knowing the poor are too terrified to be visible. And it worked. For a while. Beggars became scarcer, not because poverty vanished. Oh no, poverty thrived. But because the poor learned to disappear, to hide, to blend in, to beg only in places where no one could see, to trade visibility for survival. Some cut off their hair. Others blackened their teeth or faked illnesses to justify their begging, because a sick beggar was less likely to be whipped than a sturdy one. So you either performed weakness or invited violence. There's irony here, of course. The Act claimed to reduce vagrancy by force, but what it really did was institutionalize suffering. It taught people that kindness was dangerous, that asking for help was a risk, that hunger was a crime. It's not justice. It's branding desperation as evil. And, the real tragedy, this model stuck. Later laws, like the 1598 and 1601 Poor Laws, built on it. They introduced more classifications, more workhouses, more punishment. The system evolved, sure, but always with the same thesis: if you're poor, you're guilty. You met a man once, Elias, branded, flogged, survived. He begged with his shirt half open, so people would see the V, and maybe toss a coin out of pity, or guilt, or fascination. He said it didn't hurt anymore, but you didn't believe him. He looked hollow, like someone who'd been scraped out and left to dry in the sun. That's what this act did. It didn't just break backs, it broke souls. And yet, through it all, you kept going, you kept walking, kept begging, kept hoping, foolishly, bravely, that maybe someone somewhere would see the human beneath the law, because deep down, you know this much is true. You're not the threat, you're just the scapegoat. You don't remember exactly how you arrived. Your legs carried you without thinking. A blur of road and rain, fields fenced off with thorns, towns that spat you out like spoiled milk. But here, this place was different. You passed the boundary stone, expecting the usual scowl, but no one chased you. No one raised a stick. No one even noticed. That, in itself, felt like mercy. The village was small, not rich, but not quite collapsing either. The streets weren't paved, but they were swept. The houses sagged politely instead of aggressively. You wandered toward the churchyard, out of habit, prepared to sleep beneath the stone arch where the wind cuts sideways, and that's when she saw you, the widow, grey hair tucked into a scarf, a basket on one hip, a face carved with the lines of 100 storms. She looked at you, really looked, and something in her expression shifted. She didn't smile, that would have been too much, but she nodded, like she'd seen this story before. She handed you half a loaf. Said nothing. Walked away. You didn't cry. Not then. You hadn't earned that yet. The next morning, a boy threw you a heel of bread from a doorway. Not mockingly, not with laughter, just casual generosity. Like it wasn't a performance. Like it didn't need a thank you. You stayed near the outskirts, ready to be evicted at any moment, but no one came. Not the beadle, not the constable, not even a bored apprentice with something to prove. You existed quietly, and they allowed it. Then came the baker. You'd been hovering near his door, watching the steam curl from the chimney like a dream you weren't allowed to have. He saw you, didn't shout, just tilted his head toward the wall. You can warm your hands. Don't touch anything. So you did. You sat by the bricks while the sun rose. The smell of yeast, flour, smoke and heaven wrapped around you. Your hands thawed. You didn't steal. You didn't And when he brought out the day's rejects, broken loaves, burnt crusts, he set one near your foot, not in your hand, not with fanfare, just there. Yours, if you wanted it. You wanted it. Let that settle in. The smallest acts felt like salvation. It wasn't utopia. No one invited you in for stew. No one offered a bed. But they let you stay. And that was more than you'd had in years. You learned the rhythms of the place. When the butcher dumped scraps, when the chapel bells rang, which dogs barked too loud and which children stared too long. You kept to yourself. You became a shadow with a pulse, still poor, still ragged, but no longer hunted. You saw the widow again. She gave you apples this time, wrinkled and bruised, but sweet inside. She didn't ask your name. Maybe she didn't want to know. Names come with attachments, with responsibility. Maybe she'd lost someone once. Maybe this was penance. Or maybe she just remembered what hunger felt like. And for a moment, just a breath, you felt like a person again. But you didn't relax. You couldn't. Kindness in Tudor England was rare and temporary, like a patch of sun between storms. You took what you could. You never asked for more. Others passed through. You met a man with a twisted leg who spoke only in rhyme, a girl who'd escaped from a workhouse, a mother with 3 children and eyes like fog. Some stayed a day, some stayed longer. The town didn't welcome them, but it didn't chase them either. You shared your fire, you split your loaf. One night it snowed, thick and silent. You curled under the eaves of the stable, shivering so hard your teeth sounded like dice in a cup. Just when you thought your body might quit, a door opened, a boy's voice. "The widow's barn," he said. "Just for the night. A pile of straw. Don't tell anyone." You didn't sleep. Not really. Too warm, too safe. Your body didn't know what to do with comfort. You stared at the rafters and waited for the dream to end. It did. Morning came. You left. The barn was locked again. But the boy nodded when he saw you the next day. And the baker didn't look surprised when you returned to the wall. It wasn't home. It never could be. But for a few short days, you weren't an animal. You weren't a crime. You were just there. And then, inevitably it ended. A new constable. Younger. Sharper. Full of rules and duty and pride. He saw you. He frowned. He asked questions. The kind that start with "What are you doing here?" and end with "You'll need to move along." You packed nothing. You had nothing. You left. No one stopped you. But as you passed the widow's house, something clinked at your feet. A small cloth bundle. Inside, a crust. An apple. A coin. You didn't look back. Even the warmest bread goes cold eventually. No one knows the exact moment your body gave up. Maybe it was the night frost finally won the argument with your blood. Maybe it was the spoiled meat from a roadside ditch. Maybe your heart just got tired of losing. There was no dramatic collapse, no crowd, no priest holding your hand, whispering psalms as your soul fluttered upward. You simply lay down beneath the hedgerow you'd claimed as your final shelter, and didn't get back up. When the baker saw you the next morning, still, stiff, pale, he sighed, not in horror, in recognition. The same way you'd sigh at the first chill of winter, as if to say yes, of course, it's time again. You weren't the first. A constable came, not the cruel one, an older man with a limp and a nose for death. He didn't kick your body or call you names. He poked you once with a stick to be sure. Then he sent a boy to fetch the gravedigger. They didn't ask your name, didn't care where you were from. You were just a poor, a stray. Another note in the margins of the village's account book. The parish would cover the burial. Barely. You'd be laid in the pauper's pit. No coffin, no sermon, just a hole, a prayer mumbled out of obligation, and soil. Your grave was shared. Others had already been placed below, wrapped in rags, cold like question marks. The digger said nothing as he covered you. He'd done this before. He'd do it again. There was no marker, no stone, just earth, slightly raised, slightly disturbed. A week later, even that would flatten. But here's what the records won't say. You once made a child laugh by juggling rotten turnips. You gave your last scrap of bread to a woman with no teeth. You whispered stories to yourself to stay sane. You remembered the names of flowers even when no one asked you to. You once held a dying man's hand until he let go. You lived. Not grandly, not comfortably, but honestly, desperately, humanly. And that mattered, because there were thousands like you, each with a name once. A family, a moment of joy, a heartbreak, a scar behind the left ear from a childhood fall. And when the world turned cold, you adapted. You stumbled through it. You kept breathing longer than anyone thought you would. That's not failure. That's survival. You were mocked, feared, erased, but you were never alone. The pit held many. And above it, life went on. Children ran. Carts rolled by. Bells rang. And somewhere, a widow paused at her window and noticed the silence where you used to be. She didn't cry, but she looked longer than usual. Let that settle in. Someone noticed you were gone. History will not remember your name. It will remember Elizabeth I and her laws, and the noblemen who made fortunes from wool. But it will not remember you, the backbone of suffering that held the kingdom up while it danced in finery. But that doesn't mean you were nothing. In fact, you were everything. You were the cautionary tale, the walking sermon, the social glue that justified charity and policy alike. People define themselves by not being you. Your presence shaped entire acts of parliament. Your absence echoed through church pews and town halls. You, nameless beggar, were the moral barometer of an empire. And now, you're gone. But not quite. Because centuries later, someone will stand in a museum. They'll see a replica badge marked V. They'll read a plaque about Tudor poverty. Maybe they'll frown. Maybe they'll feel a flicker of sadness. And maybe, for a fleeting moment, they'll imagine you, just like we are now. And in that moment you'll exist again. A whisper in time. A shadow with weight. Not forgotten. Just delayed. Centuries later, someone walks the streets you once shuffled down barefoot. They wear headphones, drink something called a flat white, and snap photos of a quaint Tudor cottage now selling soy candles and historical scones. The sign out front says the building was once home to a local merchant. What it doesn't say is that you once slept beside its firewood pile. A school group gathers at the market square. Their teacher explains that this is where the stocks once stood. And yes, poor people were punished here for begging. One boy raises his hand and asks, "So, they went to jail for being homeless?" The teacher wince says something about different times. The kids nod. They move on. You, of course, are not in the textbook. Not really. Maybe your type is. There's a paragraph about Tudor vagrants. A neat little summary of legislative cruelty, wrapped in academic passive voice. No names, no smells, no frostbite, no rats, just the word undeserving. That's the official version. But unofficially? You echo in every city ordinance banning sleeping on benches, in every charity gala that costs more than a year of rent, in every uncomfortable look someone gives a person holding a cardboard sign. They don't say vagabond anymore. They say transient, loiterer, nuisance, different word, same fear. You would recognize the pattern. And yet, not everything stayed cruel. There's a museum in London, tucked in a corner exhibit, behind glass. is a leather pouch, cracked, empty. The tag says, possibly belonging to a Tudor vagrant, found near a parish boundary. No one knows who owned it. But someone dusted it, catalogued it, chose to preserve it. They don't know it was yours, but maybe it was. In another room, there's a reconstructed pauper's grave, a symbolic pit lined with stone. Visitors pass by quickly. It's not the flashy exhibit. There are no swords, no crowns, just bones, arranged with care, labeled unknown poor. One visitor stands there longer than most. A young woman. She reads every word. Her eyes well up. She doesn't take a photo. She just whispers, "I'm sorry." So yeah, you echo. Your suffering wasn't recorded in ink, but in systems, in assumptions, in inherited guilt. You were invisible, but your outline shaped society. You were a negative space carved into law and memory, the shadow that made the light seem brighter. And, in the quieter corners of modernity, people are starting to notice. Historians write papers titled, "The Human Cost of Tudor Poverty." Plays are staged that include characters like you, a beggar who doesn't die in the first act, a figure who speaks, who remembers. Someone paints a portrait of a Tudor alley. You're in it, imagined maybe, a face in the fog, but placed there deliberately, as if the artist knew history was incomplete without you. And school children, some of them ask better questions now. Why didn't they help them? Was it really their fault? What would I have done? Not everyone cares, but some do. And that's more than you ever had in life. There's even a podcast, niche, obscure, that does dramatic readings of Tudor laws. The host, between jokes about chamber pots and pox, pauses to say, "Can you imagine living like that?" And for a second their voice softens, not performatively, not for effect, just a moment of real reflection. So maybe that's what they'd say about you now. That you mattered, that you were failed, not flawed, that your existence wasn't a mistake, but a message, that the world has always been good at forgetting people who don't fit in tidy categories, but sometimes someone tries to remember. A historian stumbles across a burial record, unidentified vagrant, male, found near the West Field, no age, no relatives, just a date, but she underlines it. She puts it in her article. She calls it a glimpse into forgotten humanity. That was you. You are footnotes now. Quotes in articles. Details in scripts like this one. But even that is a kind of resurrection. Because tonight, someone is listening. Maybe lying in bed, drifting towards sleep. Thinking about the life you lived. The life no one thought was worth remembering. And now it is. You're not cold anymore. There's no wind gnawing at your fingers. No stone pressing against your spine. No rats whispering threats beside your ear as you try to sleep with one eye open. The hunger has faded. The ache in your limbs gone. The gnawing fear of footsteps approaching in the dark. Just an echo now. You've made it. To the end. Whatever that means. Sleep, at last, is no longer something to be stolen or earned. It is yours. Given freely, not in the ditch behind a chapel, not on a stranger's barn floor, but here, in this warm little pause between history and memory, a quiet breath, after centuries of holding it in. So breathe. The world you knew is gone. The beadle has retired. The laws have been rewritten, renamed, reframed. The undeserving poor have been replaced by new bureaucratic euphemisms. But tonight, none of that matters. Tonight, you are not a problem to be solved. Not a burden, not a mistake. You are simply you. A soul that existed, suffered, persisted, and now you're allowed to rest. Let that sink in. The fact that someone, somewhere, finally let you rest. There is a softness to this moment. A kindness even. Not the forced sermon-laced charity of Tudor England, but something more honest. The kind of kindness that asks nothing of you. No performance, no grovelling, no wounds to display or tragedies to recite. Just silence. Just peace. You deserve that. You always did. In another life, maybe you would have been a storyteller, a cobbler, a parent, a neighbour, known for their jokes or songs. Maybe you were all those things once, before the hunger, before the laws, before history rewrote your role as vagrant. Now there are no more roles, just rest. The fire is warm. You don't have to beg for a seat near it. No one is watching, waiting to judge how convincingly you suffer. You can close your eyes without fear. No lice, no frost, no curfews enforced with sticks. Sleep isn't a fight anymore. And outside this moment, far away, someone remembers you. Maybe just as a whisper, or a single sentence they heard tonight. But it's enough. You've been seen. And being seen, even once, even centuries later, changes something. Not in history, in humanity. You were never the villain in your story. You were the survivor. The background character who held up the whole set. The invisible thread tying together centuries of poverty, law, resistance, and quiet resilience. And now? Now you're safe. Sort of. Because the world is still complicated. People still sleep outside under cardboard heavens. Governments still fumble between help and harm. But in this tiny pocket of time, right now, right here, none of that noise matters. You are not hungry. You are not dirty. You are not disposable. You are here. You made it. So, sleep now, beggar. Not because you have to, but because you can. And know this, you were invisible then. But tonight, we saw you. If you made it this far, you just walked in the rags of history and felt every stone beneath your bare feet. Subscribe if you want more strange, forgotten stories, because the past wasn't pretty, but it deserves to be remembered. Even the boring bits.